Today's brief has been created with open source information readily available on the internet as well as books. However, take it with a pinch of salt because some aspects have been kept secret due to said country's Official Secrets Act, and sometimes Wikipedia is probably the best place to find the information. So sit back, relax, and let's get into today's briefing. The Ticonderoga class cruiser were to be a new class of conventionally powered cruisers built on the Spurrence class destroyer hull that was staple of the United States Navy at the time. Using this destroyer hull, the United States Navy were to be able to create a new class of destroyer for a low cost, to complement a new, larger strike cruiser in the development stage. These were to both utilize a recent development from Lockheed Martin, the AEGIS Combat Information System, consisting of 4 large phase planning arrays integrated into the ship's weapons and combat information systems. However, adding this new system to the current Spurrence class destroyer design wouldn't do. The superstructure for these ships would need to be completely redesigned. The upper works were, on the older destroyers, a sort of 1960s/1970s look, with large Cassegrain radars plastered all over it. The Tycos, at the time, they were destroyers, would have a larger, flatter superstructure, with larger flat places for the radar emitters to be positioned for full 360 degrees of coverage. After a period of designs, it was to be proven that a large superstructure forward and a small superstructure atop the existing hangar off to the port quarter would suffice for a full 360 degrees of coverage. And so, with a plan for the superstructure confirmed, the design process would proceed. But it was decided to fractionally lengthen the new ships to accommodate the addition of this new superstructure. But it would end up being calculated that these new vessels would add a whopping 1,500 tons to the Spurrence class design. That is a 19.4% increase in overall displacement, resulting in an increase to the overall draft by 2 meters. Based on this increase, the hull would sit about 30 centimeters taller above the waterline to the main deck than the Spurrences before them. Now, aside from the fact that the increase in size due to a larger superstructure, the design was going to be intended to not be an anti-submarine warfare destroyer like the Spurrence, but these would be an anti-air warfare destroyer, designed to use the recently developed SM-2 medium-range surface-to-air missile system, fitted forward and aft on twin-arm launchers, similar to that found on Terrier-fitted vessels. The project would end up having the final design finalised and authorised in 1978. But before the lead ship could be laid down, the Strike Cruiser project was canned, and as such, the design was slightly altered to have a command-and-control function, making these ships flagships and redesignated them as cruisers. When the lead ship, CG-47, was laid down, the class would be that of 5 vessels being ordered, of which they would be 9,800 tons, 173 meters long, a beam of 16.8 meters, and a draft of 10.2 meters. The ships would be powered by 4 General Electric LM2500 gas turbines, powering 2 propellers for a top speed of 32.5 knots. Estimated range is about 6,000 nautical miles at 20 knots and 3,300 nautical miles at 30 knots. These vessels would consist of a crew complement of 33 officers, 27 chief petty officers, and 324 enlisted personnel. The ship's sensor fits would consist of 1 AN SBS 49 Air Search Charlie Band radar on the main mast, 4 AN SBY-1 Alpha multifunctional Foxtrot Band 4 fixed arrays, 2 forward and 2 aft, 1 AN SBS 55 navigational India band radar, 1 SBS 64 version 9 navigational India band radar, 4 SPG 62 fire control India band radars for the SM-2 surface-to-air missile system, 1 AN SPQ-9 fire control India band radar for the 2 5-inch guns, 2 AN SLQ-32 ESM and ECM receivers, and finally 1 AN SQS-53 Alpha hull-mounted low-frequency sonar. The armament of the first 5 ships would consist of 2 quad harpoon anti-ship missiles, 2 Mark 26 twin-arm missile launchers for 68 SM-2 surface-to-air missiles, or 20 ROR-5 Asterok anti-submarine missiles, 2 5-inch 54 caliber main guns, 2 phalanx close-in weapon systems, 2 to 4 50 caliber machine guns, and 2 triple Mark 32 12.75-inch anti-submarine warfare torpedo launchers. When it comes to the construction of the class, Hull 1 and 2 would be part of the baseline 0, which would include the Ticonderoga and the Yorktown. Ticonderoga was laid down on January 21, 1980, launching on April 25, 1981, and the ship was completed by May of 1982, where she would spend 3 periods at sea for the first of class trials. Commissioning would come on January 22, 1983. USS Yorktown would be laid down on October 19, 1981, launching on January 17, 1983, and commissioning on July 4, 1984. These 2 ships would be the first ships of the first iteration of the AEGIS Combat System, with the Mark 7 combat system installed. Baseline 1 vessels would include hulls 3, 4 and 5, these units being the USS Vincennes, Valley Forge, and the Thomas S. Gates. Vincennes would be laid down on October 19, 1982, launching on January 14, 1984, and commissioning on July 6, 1985. The USS Valley Forge would be laid down on April 14, 1983, launching on June 23, 1984, and finally commissioning on January 18, 1986. Finally, the Thomas S. Gates would be, instead of being laid down at the Ingalls Shipbuilding Corporation like her earlier sisters, would be built by the Bath Iron Works in Maine, having the first module being laid down on October 31, 1984, launching on December 14, 1985, and finally commissioning on August 22, 1987. These baseline 1 vessels would include upgrades to their aircraft maneuvering systems, as well as a tactical data link system to talk to the ship's helicopter. The baseline 2 vessels would be the first of the Flight 2, with 7 vessels being ordered. These vessels would differ from the original 5 ships of the Flight 1. The major difference would come with the primary surface-to-air weapon systems. Although still being armed with SM-2, the missiles would now be fired from a Mark 41 vertical launch silo, like on the Spurrant class. This upgrade design would be drawn up prior to the start of 1984, with Hull 6, the USS Bunker Hill, being laid down on January 11, 1984, launching on March 11, 1985, and commissioning on September 20, 1986. That's the same year's commissioning of the USS Valley Forge, and she was laid down after the Bunker Hill. Hulls 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 would be the USS Mobile Bay, being laid down on June 6, 1984, launching on August 22, 1985, and commissioning on February 21, 1987. USS Antietam would be laid down on November 15, 1984, launching on February 14, 1986, and commissioning on June 6, 1987. The USS Leyte Gulf would be laid down on March 18, 1985, launching on June 20, 1986, and commissioning in September 26, 1987. USS San Jacinto would be laid down on July 24, 1985, launching on November 14, 1986, and commissioning on January 23, 1988. USS Lake Champlain would be laid down on the 3rd of March 1986, launching on April 3rd, 1987, and commissioned on August 12, 1988. And finally, the USS Philippine Sea would be laid down on April 8, 1986, launching on April 3rd, 1987, and commissioning on August 12, 1988. All ships of the baseline 2, bar the USS Philippine Sea, would be built by the Ingalls Shipbuilding Corporation, with Philippine Sea being built by the Bath Iron Works. As mentioned earlier, these vessels and the next 15 ships in the class would mount the Mark 41 vertical launch silo. This system on these ships would consist of 2 two large 61-cell launchers located on the forward and aft ends of the ship. The Mark 41 is designed to take more than just an SM-2 surface-to-air missile, but instead a multitude of weapon systems utilizing a common silo. With this, the silos can take TLAM, TASM, SM-2, SM-3, SM-6, Evolved Sea Sparrow, as well as Asarock if needs be. So with that covered, Baseline 3 would consist of hulls 13 through to 18. These vessels would introduce the AN-SPY-1 Bravo radar instead of the AN-SPY-1 Alpha that you'd see on preceding units. Now, Hull 13 would be called the USS Princeton, and she would be laid down on October 15th, 1986 from the Ingalls Shipbuilding Corporation, being launched on October 2nd, 1987, and commissioning on February 11th, 1989. Hull 14 would be named the USS Normandy, named after the battle. She would be built by the Bath Iron Works, and her first module would be laid down on April 7th, 1987, being launched just under a year later, and commissioning on December 9th, 1989. Hull 15 would be the USS Monterey, being built by the Bath Iron Works and having her first block placed on August 19th, 1987. She would launch in mid-October and then she'd be commissioned in June 1990. Hull 16 would become the USS Chancellorville, and she would be built by the Ingalls Shipbuilding Corporation. Being laid down on the 24th of June 1987, she would take 13 months to build before launching, and commissioning would come on November 4th, 1989, half a year before her sister ship, the Monterey. Hull 17 would be the USS Cowpens. This vessel would be built by the Bath Iron Works, and her keel module was laid down on December 23rd, 1987, with launch taking place on March 11th, 1989, and commissioning on March 9th, 1991. Finally, Hull 18 would be the USS Gettysburg. She was constructed by the Bath Iron Works, being laid down on August 17th, 1988, and she'd take 11 months to launch and 23 months to commission into the fleet. The final baseline would be Baseline 4, and this consisted of 9 vessels. These vessels differed from their preceding ships, with the computer systems used on board for the combat system, and in addition, a newer version of the sonar system. So, Hull 19 would be named the USS Chosin, and she'd be laid down on July 22nd, 1988 at the Ingalls Shipbuilding Corporation. Her launch would take place on September 1st, 1989, and commissioning on January 12th, 1991. Hull 20 became the USS Hugh City. She again would be built by the Ingalls Shipbuilding Corporation, laying down on February 20th, 1989, launching on June 1st, 1990, and commissioning took place in the following year, September 14th, 1991. Hull 21 became the USS Shiloh. She would be built by the Bath Iron Works, with the keel being laid on August 1st, 1989, and launching 13 months later. She would be commissioned on July 18th, 1992. Hull 22 became the USS Anzio. She would be built by the Ingalls Shipbuilding Corporation, with her keel being laid on the 21st of August 1989. 14 months later, she'd be launched, and about a year and a half later, she'd be commissioned into the fleet. Hull 23 became the USS Vicksburg. She again would be built by the Ingalls Shipbuilding Corporation, with her keel being laid on the 30th of May 1990. 1.5 years later, she'd be launched, and she'd end up being commissioned 13 months after that. Hull 24 became the USS Lake Erie. She became the last Tyco to be built by the Bath Iron Works, being laid down on March 6, 1990, launching 14 months later, and the commissioning just under 2 years later. Hull 25 became the USS Cape St. George. Herself and the last 2 ships would be built by the Ingalls Shipbuilding Corporation. Her keel was laid on the 19th of November 1990, with launch taking place 14 months later and commissioning taking place 15 months after that. Hull 26 became the USS Vela Gulf. She had a keel laying ceremony on the April 22nd, 1990, taking 14 months to launch, and commissioning was 14 months after that. Finally, Hull 27 became the USS Port Royal. Being the last ship of the class, she would be laid down on October 18, 1991, launching 13 months later and commissioning 19 months after that. And by God, that was a lot of ships. Now, it's customary for myself that because there's so many ships in this class, I am not going to basically cover each one's service career, because, well, that's at least 27 new videos I could do in the future. So that's what I'm going to do. But there is a couple of ships here that I can talk about vaguely that have some pretty famous incidents, or pretty infamous incidents, and we shall cover a couple of them in a second. The first ship I want to look at has to be the most infamous in terms of this class, and this is the USS Vincennes. Now, I think most people know about this incident. However, for those of you who don't know, or are new to this, the USS Vincennes was operating in the Strait of Hormuz in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq War, or as it's also known, the Tanker War. She would detect an aircraft taken off from Bandar Abbas. Now, personnel on board the Vincennes mis-ID'd this aircraft as an Iranian F-14 Tomcat on an attack vector. This would be believed due to misreported radar returns. Now, I don't really want to touch on this subject in depth, but some miscalculations led to the airliner being shot down by a SM-2 missile and the tragic death of 290 civilians on board. I am planning to do this in a more of an in-depth video in the future, but for now, that's where I'm going to leave it. Now, moving on to something a little bit more humorous in, well, one aspect, we come to the USS Yorktown. Now, Yorktown is famous for two incidents, where one was at the hands of a Soviet captain, and the other was a major computer error. Touching on the first incident, so the Yorktown and the USS Karen was basically operating in the Black Sea, where they got rammed in the port quarter by the captain commanding the Soviet frigate, the Bezavteny. The reason for this being that it was believed that the NATO units had illegally entered Russian territorial waters, and as such this Soviet captain decided to play bumper cars with a cruiser and a destroyer. Ironically enough, some pretty decent photos of this little Krivak trying to ram the back end of the Yorktown is quite funny and quite cool. Now, the second incident came when they were testing a new computer system. However, it proved that the system didn't really work in some technical aspect I don't really understand, but it basically resulted in a total electrical failure in terms of the propulsion system, and that resulted in the ship being towed back to harbour on a few occasions. Current open source intelligence suggests that all bar one Flyco Tycho 1 has been scrapped. The Tycho went to the scrapyard in Brownsville in 2020. Vincennes went to the scrapyard in the Sky in 2011. Valley Forge got indexed in a SyncX. Thomas S. Gates was scrapped in 2017. And the Yorktown is still around, but in a dilapidated state, in the Philadelphia Naval Yard, waiting for the long cruise to the scrapyard. In terms of the later units, 6 units have been slated for decommission in 2022, with San Jacinto, Lake Champlain, Monterey, Hugh City, Anzio, Vela Gulf, and Port Royal. 2023 is slated to see the Bunker Hill and Mobile Bay be decommissioned. 2024 would see the Antietam and Shiloh be decommissioned, and finally in 2026 it's slated to see the Chancellorsville be decommissioned. Aside from that, there will be a couple more vessels still knocking around, but they haven't actually been given their decommissioning dates as of yet. So that's it, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you learned something new. Don't forget to like the video before you leave a comment, and give a suggestion of what you think I should do next, as well as if you have a question you want me to answer, please put it in the comment section on the pinned post. Apart from that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, I recommend doing so, because I have some very interesting content coming out very soon. If you want to support the channel, there is a Patreon page, but that's entirely up to you. If you do so, there is some interesting perks to actually being a Patreon to the page. Apart from that, all you need to do is say thank you very much, have a nice day, and here's a sneak peek at next week's video.